Oyez, oyez, oyez. The Court of Appeals for the 4th Judicial Appellate District is now open pursuant to call.
Welcome to the 4th Court of Appeals, and thank you for attending today to honor the memory of Mr. Philip Bozzo, Jr. I am Chief Justice Rebecca Martinez, and I am joined by my fellow justices on the court. Justice Patricia Alvarez, Justice Luz Elena Chapa sends her regrets and expresses her condolences to the Bozzo family. Justice Irene Rios, Justice Beth Watkins, Justice Liza A. Rodriguez, and Justice Lori Valenzuela. This is an official proceeding of the court, and as such, we have a court reporter, Mrs. Van Slyke, who is taking a formal record this afternoon. I would like to thank the entire Bozzo family, especially Monica Elliott, for allowing us to continue the tradition of holding court memorials in collaboration with the San Antonio Bar Association. On behalf of the entire 4th Court of Appeals, we send our deepest condolences to all of his children, his brother, extended family, and dear friends, many of whom are viewing here as we live stream on our YouTube channel. We are fortunate to have one of Mr. Bozzo's dear friends and colleagues here with us today, Mr. Robin Allen Teague. Mr. Teague has been gracious enough to offer to make some remarks today in memory of his friend, Mr. Bozzo, and I now invite him to join the court on camera.
Thank you. These are G-rated stories about Phil Bozzo. I have fudged a little to protect the innocent and the guilty. So, do you remember the 60s and the early 70s? We were there, both Phil and I. Hippies, long hair, flower children. Yes, we are still in Vietnam. The Tet Offensive is over with. Buddy Mike Casey, who later became a buddy and served at Long Binh, and my brother, who served at Da Nang, have returned home, thankfully. Phil and me, we were in the draft lottery, and both of us drew high lottery numbers. We were fortunate sons. Phil and I both went to the University of Texas, and in 1970, I had just graduated from college. Phil, who's a little bit younger than me, had a few years left to go. I should say that neither one of us was on a fast track at that time. Going to classes was not our first priority. But I'm sticking with the G-rated part of this. Our first meeting was in 1970 or 1971. We remembered where and when, just not the meeting itself. Of course, we don't remember those times. Imagine that you are in Austin, Texas, in the late 60s or the early 70s, and you're at Armadillo World Headquarters. You hear live from deep in the heart of Texas, Commander Cody and the Lost Planet Airmen. Too much fun, that's news to me. Too much fun, there must be a whole lot of things that I've never done, but I ain't never had too much fun. That about sums it up for Phil and me, at least at those times. And I'm sorry that I can't sing. So let's go to the state capitol, 1970, 1971. Both of us had offices at the state capitol in the lower level of the Capitol building. Really, we did. We were down our offices were down the hallways from each other. We were in our early 20s at this time. So did we cross paths while we were working in the Capitol? Yes, of course we did. One of the ways that we remember that we crossed paths was that we both went to the offices of the Texas Trial Lawyers Association, which was across the street from the Capitol in the Westgate building. TTLA had at that time a free buffet every day. And when we could break away from our duties, we loved to go over to the TTLA. You might recall that this was during the heyday of plaintiff's personal injury practice. We were in the golden age at that time. There were lawyers who had practiced personal injury law as plaintiffs who were actually on the Supreme Court of Texas at that time. So the buffet, shrimp, oysters, whiskey, we thought we were pretty big time at that time, and we were mingling with a lot of big shots. So what did we do when we were working at the Capitol? Phil was working for a member of the Dirty 30, and I was working for Speaker of the House, Gus Mutcher. Those of you who remember those times know that the Dirty 30 was against Speaker Mutcher, thought he was crooked, and as it turned out, he was. So I was working at that time for a criminal. I want you to know, though, I did not know anything. So I got an early start in an unusual way in criminal law. Speaker Mutcher was convicted of bank fraud in the Sharpstown bank fraud scandal. Phil got to continue his career working at the Texas legislature for a while before, I think it was before he went to work for one of the leading advertising firms in Austin. So I went to started law school in 1971. Phil went to law school at South Texas Law School in Houston, and I went to law school in San Antonio at St. Mary's. Phil practiced criminal defense almost before he even left law school. He was quite fortunate in that he clerked for the legendary Clyde Woody and Marion Rosen. They were some of the leading criminal defense lawyers of their time in Houston. He also practiced for a time with the famed Robert and Philip Scardino. One of them is still alive. I'm not sure which one of those. Phil and his family moved to San Antonio. I'm not sure exactly when. So let's go to the law offices of Robert Price and Cheryl Wilson on South Presa Street. There, Phil and I meet again. This is years later from when we first met. At this time, or soon thereafter, Phil had developed an enviable criminal defense and personal injury practice. I have no idea how he did this, but it was quite a remarkable practice. So by this point, Phil had learned some valuable lessons in criminal defense. He learned the lesson taught by the late, great Jimmy Parks, who would tell his clients who wanted to turn down a good offer, "I can get you more." Or he also learned the lesson taught by our colleague, Rusty Geyer, who would tell his clients who had turned down or wanted to turn down a good offer, "I am going to spend the night in my own bed tonight. Let's go to trial." And from me, he learned the lesson about setting fees. A gunfighter does not charge by the bullet. I learned that from my mentor, Stanley Rosenberg. So joint ventures and co-counseling. Phil and I were joint venturers or co-counsel in several civil cases. We never tried a case together in the way that you might think we would try a case together, but I did represent Phil one time in a JP court case, the Otero case. I don't remember what it was about, but he had had a spat with one of his clients or former clients. And I defended him in that case. And I remember that I had a much better time than he did in that case until it was over with, because I got to pick a jury in JP court. And I enjoyed doing that because at that point, I had learned some techniques For example, the looping technique where I could get jurors to talk amongst each other about what they agreed and disagreed with. And as you might imagine, there was a controversial issue in that case because Phil Bozzo is a lawyer. And so I wanted the jurors, the potential jurors, to talk about what their feelings were on lawyers. The case settled during deliberations. Everybody went home happy. Phil and I probably went and got a cold beer. Baseball. Phil and I both played high school baseball. Phil and Monica have 3 children, and one of them is Phil Jr. I call Phil Jr. I call Phil's son Phil Jr. because I think of him as Junior. I think actually he might be the 3rd. But Phil Jr. played baseball at Alamo Heights High School. He's a good baseball player. So I am imagining again playing catch in the front yard at Phil and Monica's home in Alamo Heights. Flies and skinners. I can remember Phil taking Phil Jr. and me to the ballpark at Incarnate Word University, where he hit flies and skinners to both of us. And I could barely, at that time, I was old enough to where I could, or so old enough that I could barely throw from first base to third base, but I did, and I think it was on one bounce. Softball, we had some misfortunes, but we did get to play one game for Jimmy Allison's team. And I went to bat, my first time at bat, and hit a grounder and tried to beat it out and pulled a hamstring muscle, and that was the end of softball for me. A similar fate occurred to Phil, and so he and I began and ended our softball careers in the first game. So Longhorn baseball. Phil and I went to lots of UT baseball games in Austin. One time stands out in my memory, and Monica will remember this. The one time that stands out in my memory was with Phil's entire family, almost his entire family. The Longhorns at that time were in the Super Regional at Disch-Falk Field in Austin. Phil loaded up the family van. Phil's mother, Monica, Phil Jr., Alejandro, and I think Lena was with us. And of course, I was there too. So our first stop, at that time, our favorite place to stop was the Ironworks in Austin at Red River and Cesar Chavez Boulevard, which used to be First Street. By the way, the alternative to the Ironworks now is Hoover's Cooking over near Disch-Falk Field. So back to the Ironworks. Ribs, sausage, brisket, coleslaw, potato salad, beans. It was all incredibly delicious and a great way to start. So our next stop was the Disch-Falk Field. At that time, there were no stands on the third base line and the first base line beyond the bases. In other words, when you got out to the outfield, there were no stands on those baselines in the outfield. What there was a grassy berm, Bermuda grass, and it kind of sloped down to the field. There were hundreds of people that were sitting on that grassy berm, and we were among them, all 5 or 6 or 7 of us. I can't remember how many. The heat was extraordinary that day. 96 degrees was the official temperature, but we were sitting in the sun. No clouds in the sky, no umbrellas. It was over 100 degrees, and it was a blistering day. The game was a great game for the home team, for us. University of Texas won that game, and I believe from that game they went on to the College World Series, which is the ultimate goal for college baseball teams. What I remember the most about that game is how Monica and Phil and I would talk several times about Phil's mother, who was with us during the entire game, sitting out in the sun. She was as old as I am now, if not older. And we cannot imagine that she was comfortable doing that, but she was a trooper and she loved being with us, and we loved her being with us too. So briefly mention some other things that Phil and I did together. Camping. Phil, Rusty Geyer, and I went on a camping trip with some outfitters and guides, and we rode horseback up the Florida River in southwestern Colorado and had a really good time doing that. So now what you have been waiting for, some of you, what you've been waiting for. And I should say, some of you are thinking that I'm about ready to go into the X-rated part. Some of you might be thinking that I'm going to talk about the annual banquet of the George Hands Society, especially the one where Monica and Phil went to dinner with Jimmy Parks and his wife. Well, I'm not going to go there. So what are you waiting for? You're waiting for the story about Phil Bozzo, the legendary social chairman. Phil and I and some others started off getting beers at La Tuna, which is on South Alamo Street, across the street from Blue Star. We went to La Tuna for several years. And then James Lifshutz began to develop Blue Star Brewing, or actually Blue Star, and Joey Villarreal began to develop Blue Star Brewing, which is a bar and restaurant in Blue Star. And so for some reason, we decided to go from La Tuna one time to go over and try Blue Star Brewing. We met Joey Villarreal at that time and really liked Blue Star Brewing. And we went there several times after that, and we liked it so much that we decided to keep Joey in business. And I think we did a pretty good job of doing that. He's still going strong. So what's the call to order? Well, Phil, being the social chairman, had a contact list in his cell phone. And on that contact list was, I guess, at least 20 lawyers, if not more. When he decided he wanted to go, he would call me about the day we wanted to go, and I would pick the day, or we would agree on a day, and then he would send out an a cell phone text message blast to everybody, telling them when we were going to go to Blue Star for a beer. So Phil and I were known to go to extremes. Summertime, we would sit out on the upper deck at Blue Star Brewing in the sun, 100-degree temperatures several times, no shade, no umbrella, just baseball caps and sunglasses and cold beer. So the wintertime, we were in the wintertime known as the Polar Bear Club. On days when the temperature was at or below freezing, Phil would bring out gloves, beanies, wool scarves, coats, blankets. Yes, I'm talking about blankets. And then he would wrap himself in blankets, and Phil Bozzo and Mike Casey, if he was with us, would also be wrapped in a blanket. Actually, Phil would wrap it around Mike. And of course, cigars. That was a big deal for Phil. Always a new cigar every time we went. And a lot of times, if not all the time, he would bring cigars for everybody there. And I didn't smoke a cigar, but if I wanted one, there was always a cigar for me. So Phil came prepared, and he prepared for everyone else. So the last time I saw Phil, it was at Blue Star Brewing. With us were Mike Casey, Andy Laird, who Caitlin Van Slyke knows well, James Jennings, Phil, and me. We were the core group, the regulars. Phil and cigars and beer and buddies goes together. We were together for probably an hour, hour and a half that day. And I had to leave before everybody else left. I think James Jennings and I left about the same time. Mike Casey left about the same time with us. And I can still remember as I drove away out of the parking lot and drove past Blue Star Brewing, Phil and Andy were out there on the deck having a cold beer, Phil smoking a big cigar, leaning into each other as I am to you. It's like the old man talking to the young kid. We will miss Phil. He was the glue that held our group together for years and years. And we will get together again soon and make a toast to Phil. Here's to Phil. Thank you.
Thank you again, Mr. T, for your presence here today and for your lovely remarks. The Fourth Court of Appeals has held a court memorial to celebrate and recognize those departed members of the San Antonio Bar Association who have contributed to our legal community. Mr. Bozzo was an esteemed and respected colleague, and as you've heard, both friend and social chairman, who brought so many together in and out of the courtroom. I now invite Mr. David Evans, President of the San Antonio Bar Association, who will read a formal resolution entered on behalf of the San Antonio Bar.
Hello, my name is Dave Evans, and I'm the San Antonio Bar Association President, here to present a memorial resolution on the death of Philip Bozzo, Jr. Whereas Philip Bozzo, Jr., born on August 11, 1949, passed away on February 24, 2019, and whereas Mr. Bozzo graduated from the University of Texas at Austin with a BA in journalism and the South Texas College of Law in 1978. Whereas Mr. Bozzo practiced as a solo practitioner for over 40 years and was held in high regard for advocacy and devotion to the law. And whereas Mr. Bozzo was admitted to the Supreme Court of the State of Texas, the U.S. District Court of the Western District of Texas, and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. He was also a board director of the San Antonio Criminal Defense Lawyers Association, a member of the Texas Trial Lawyers Association, and the Texas Criminal Defense Lawyers Association. Whereas Mr. Bozzo is survived by his children Lena, Philip, and Hondo, and the mother of his children, Monica Elliott, daughter Kristen Stokowski, brother Paul Bozzo, and many loving nieces and nephews. Be it resolved that the San Antonio Bar Association and the Fourth Court of Appeals of Texas express their genuine regret on the death of Philip Bozzo Jr. and express their sincerest sympathy to his family and his friends. Be it further resolved that this resolution be appended to the minutes of the San Antonio Bar Association and copies sent to his family. Be it further resolved that this resolution be placed in the permanent records and minutes of the Fourth Court of Appeals of Texas, dated this 8th day of April, 2021.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. So moved and granted, the permanent records and minutes of this court shall reflect the proceedings of today honoring the life of Mr. Philip Bozzo Jr., and a copy of the record and resolution will be shared with the Bozzo family. We will hurdle any other technical difficulties, and the archive of this court memorial will be placed also on the YouTube channel of the Fourth Court of Appeals. At this time, the court would also like to recognize our court reporter, Ms. Van Slyke, with Kathy Hoffman, court reporters, who has offered her pro bono services for these court memorials for so many years, hosted here at the Fourth Court in conjunction with the San Antonio Bar Association. Again, on behalf of the Fourth Court of Appeals and the San Antonio Bar Association, we thank everyone here and are most grateful for the Bozzo family for allowing us to recognize the contributions of Mr. Philip Bozzo. At this time, I'd like to invite comments from members of the court, many of whom practiced and walked the halls here in Bexar County with Mr. Bozzo, and would like to share a few comments on their behalf At this time, I would like to invite Justice Irene Rios to share a few comments.
Everyone's. First off, I would like to begin by thanking the Bozzo family, thanking you for accepting our court's invitation to honor Phil Bozzo in our court memorial today. So thank you very much. I got to meet him in the early 2000s, so about 20 years ago, when I sat on a trial bench. He practiced in front of me. And I really loved having him in court. He was a very, very capable lawyer. But not only was he a capable lawyer, we got to have talks. And so we got to have a lot of talks. And we talked about our families. We talked about Longhorns. We talked about his rental properties. And I really enjoyed his practicing before me. But there's one thing that I will always remember him for, and he holds a special place in the history of my life when I was a trial judge. When I'd been a trial judge for many years, the Commissioner's Court had prepared a new courtroom for me to move into. And so Mr. Bozzo and another lawyer were they were the attorneys who tried the very last jury trial before me in my old courtroom. So I even took a picture, and I was looking for it, and I have so many pictures, I couldn't find it. I would have loved to share it with you. But he was the one, I'll always remember him, that when we finished the trial, we turned off the lights and shut the door to the courtroom, and that was the end of that chapter in that courtroom. And then, I moved to a new courtroom. But I'll always remember that, and I'll remember our special talks. He talked about his family. I mean, you could tell he's just a really good human being and good family man. And I just want to say that he was a very well-respected member of our legal community. And thank you so much. I'm so honored to have met him and have him practice before me. And I just thank you very much for this opportunity to honor him.
Thank you, Justice Rios. And finally, I'd invite comments from Justice Beth Watkins.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to say a few words about Phil. One of my first cases in this Court of Appeals was an appeal from a criminal case that Phil tried. He tried a solid case, and we worked together on the motion for new trial before we went on to appeal to the Fourth Court and ultimately to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. I actually think that my first oral argument before the Fourth Court was in that case that I had the privilege to work on with Phil. And I had been a lawyer for about 2 years. I remember feeling so out of my depth, but I have such fond memories of Phil, this seasoned and well-respected lawyer with a phenomenal head of hair. I remember him just being so helpful, so supportive. When we had oral argument, he came and sat in the courtroom to continue to support our client, and I felt the support from him. I will always remember with gratitude his well-honed instincts, his generosity, and the zeal with which he represented his clients. Our legal community mourns his loss, and we all extend our sincere condolences to Phil's family. Thank you for letting me share this memory.
And with those final comments, thank you again all for your attendance, and court is adjourned.